I am so excited to be here. This is an incredible camp. Take a look around. This is incredible. When I walked in, I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was at Seabase part of the time. Felt like I was at the ISS part of the time. This is amazing. So really a huge round of applause for all of the people that worked on putting this together. A lot of hard work, energy, and love has gone into creating this experience, so enjoy it. So I wanted to spend a bit of time talking to you about why IPFS matters and why the work that we're doing is important, and not just now, but in the future, meaning there are a lot of things happening right now in the world that over time will accumulate to something very significant, and those decisions are being made now. So David and Molly asked me to talk about IPFS from the beginning, so I figured I would start at the beginning. Let's see. No. All credit for that goes to Melody Sheep, who's an amazing artist. And the reason I like starting this way is because we often forget that we are at the culmination of a very, very long history of the universe becoming aware, of the universe producing you and other things. So shorting it, it's often really useful to look back and to look forward. And so if we look back and we think of not just the last 5 years or the last 10 years, but we try to really look back at our history, and we think about things a million years ago, we can think of the technologies and things that shaped us and things that changed from the past. We can think of those shifting, and by 100,000 years ago, things started to look pretty different. We started to organize in various different ways. Things started picking up speed around 10,000 years ago with different kinds of innovations. And so on, it kept getting crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier. And so this is an incredible speed of development, and it's hard to understand where all of this is headed. If you try to do this towards the future, this is an exercise in futility because it's extremely difficult to predict what is going to happen. But we can try. Well, we can at least look ahead a little bit, and we can think of, say, hey, we have a lot of automation going on. We have a lot of AR and VR coming, potentially. We have, finally, the space race is back on. And we have a whole bunch of similar kinds of innovations that seem tractable. Maybe a little bit further out, we have things like human augmentation and different kinds of machine learning and narrow AI that is going to augment what we can do. Perhaps we'll start colonizing other planets. We started getting into like the 100-year mark, and that gets really fuzzy. Will we get nanotech? Will we be able to assemble anything we want? Will we be able to program the genome? Will we be able to create digital artificial intelligence? These are like the fundamental questions that are going to be decided upon the next roughly 100 years. And that might set humanity and our future in a very, very different course. What will happen after that? Will we figure out how to go faster than space travel? Will we make rogue AIs that will be evil, or from our definition of evil? Or will we make benign things? Or what exactly is going to occur? It's extremely difficult to predict. So contrast this. We can't really fathom what's going to happen 1,000 years in the future. And yet the past looks very, very understandable to us. We can trace the path of progression. So the future is very, very nebulous, and it's unclear what will occur. You try to do this further ahead, and it's just we cannot at all predict what might happen. Maybe we'll create Dyson spheres. Maybe we'll travel to across the stars. Maybe we'll create von Neumann probes and go off around the galaxy. And a million years is completely it's completely beyond our reach of being able to reason about this at this point in time. So this very simple way of compressing our timeline from 1 million years ago to 1 million years in the future demonstrates that we're part of something extremely special, something that is occurring right now here on this planet, here in this century, in this moment of space-time. It's extremely fundamentally different than the things that have been happening before. So I want to talk about computing for a moment, and computing in IPFS. I think a lot of people think about computing in terms of the printing press. They compare computing to an invention that managed to create all kinds of knowledge distribution and create different notions of communication across all different kinds of societies. And then people are like, well, maybe not. Maybe it's actually more impactful than that. Maybe it's something like writing. Writing was actually much more important as an innovation than the printing press. The printing press accelerated the distribution of writing. But writing itself gave us culture and a way to write it down and pass it on beyond kind of oral traditions. Before that, hey, maybe language itself. Could computing compare to the invention of language, the ability to create abstractions and communicate them to each other, the ability to learn together? I actually think that these are all off, and that in reality, computing is something as fundamentally important as biology itself. So we can think of the invention, in a sense, the invention by just replicators, that invention of the ability of an organism, of something material to start to evolve and to produce the wealth of biodiversity that you see around you, and that's the kind of impact that something like that kind of an innovation can have. And so that's how I think we should be thinking about computing, is that level and that scale of an innovation. In a very short amount of time, computing has gone from just a whole bunch of machines in huge rooms that you had to kind of wire together in like very simple mechanisms, all the way to having supercomputers in your pocket so that you can look at all kinds of information and do all kinds of super powerful things. So we, as humans, walk around already as cyborgs. I don't think that just because the computer is not physically embedded in you, you can think of yourself as the same as, say, a human being 1 million years ago. You're fundamentally different. You can do many, many things that your ancestors couldn't. And so that's something that we've already begun that kind of transition. So let's blaze through the history of computing, and I'm not going to talk about this. We'll just kind of we'll look at it. It's more around the relationship. The thing I wanted you to take away is the relationship between programs, data, and computers. In the beginning, there was a big machine, and we loaded it up with a bunch of data and programs, and we produced more data. We took a function and applied it to some numbers, and we got more numbers. And then we decided that we wanted to do that a lot, and we invented ways of combining these things. And we invented the way of having functions calling each other. And then we dealt with the fact that some of these functions might be problematic and might clobber other functions. And so we figured out how to create a sane way of sharing programs and sharing data. And then we said, hey, it would be really nice to not have to go to this huge room and interact with this huge device all the time. So what if I put a screen in some other room and I run a cable to this big room? And that was a great idea. And so a lot of people started doing that. And other people said, hey, what if we make more of these really big room computer things and we distribute them around the planet? And there were a bunch. There were probably around 12 in one moment, and for a decade or so, there were basically somewhere between 5 and 12 really big computers that people used. This was very successful, but then people said, hey, what if we could wire these really big room computer things to each other? And that was the beginning of networking. And that created the possibility of certain computers being able to call each other and store information and transmit it and so on. So we got the beginning of multiprocessing. And the network computers idea was so good that it kind of took the world by storm and it kept expanding. But right around that same time, people said, hey, what if this room computer was a lot smaller and we could give it to people? And you could have one in your house. And that, at the time, was seen as crazy. Many people thought that was a terrible idea. But hey, it happened to be quite popular. And a lot of people did this, and a lot of people did this, and many more people did this, and then suddenly the entire planet was carpeted with computers. But there was also a very significant shift when we went from this to plugging all of these computers that people now suddenly had in their homes or in their offices and so on to have them work together. So the internet had this significant evolution as well. There are all these different kind of networks, and people said, hey, what if these networks were able to talk to each other? And that was the beginning of the internet. And again, we kind of scaled that up, and now that thing is enormous. But for the most part, the thing to take away from this is that at the end of the day, it's just about some machine computing a function and some data being fed into that function and transmitted over some wires. There's a lot more in the details, but at the core of the main innovations to computing, it's just better and better ways of moving around functions, better and better ways of moving around data, ways of getting assurances about that data and those functions and so on. The web was probably the big moment where all of us got to suddenly experience the internet in full force. That was when suddenly programs were able to display things at us in a dynamic medium. And so first it was just moving around information. I could change the data. I could send you a link, and you could look at it. Later on, we had these browsers that could run all kinds of more complicated applications. And then we started moving to this world of like, hey, maybe there's like some server out in the world somewhere, and I'm talking to it and fetching data back and forth. And hey, maybe we can ship around these programs as well, because after all, I have a computer. So why aren't we shipping around programs? And that's how we got to the Web 2.0 world of dynamic media. And then we got to a similar kind of environment as multiprocessing, but now at a massive scale with all kinds of different groups, with all kinds of intentions, and all sorts of people caring about different things. And this was extremely successful, but it created this weird relationship between parties where suddenly you, as the user through your client computer, were mostly subservient and in a kind of arrangement with a server where the server was mostly controlling your data and the programs, and you were mostly accessing that stuff. And this grew and grew and grew. The world got an enormous amount of servers and clients and so on, and the Web 2.0 world exploded. And it left us in a world where suddenly now we have a lot of different machines around the planet. Some of them are benign, some of them are malicious, some of them are rational, meaning they'll try to cheat you if they can, but they're mostly just trying to get away with something. And then eventually we got better improvements. We said, hey, what if we could certify the data and make sure the data is actually correct? This is the beginning of things like encryption on the internet, and the beginning of the certificate authorities, and the beginning of, hey, blockchains, suddenly the ability to do computation in this medium. At the end of the day, it's just about data and programs. It's just you have some certified log of data, you're adding functions to it, you're computing on it together. And history is kind of repeating itself. We now have one blockchain. We have many blockchains. We have like an internet of blockchains. And the centralized web movement is a similar kind of thing. It said, hey, let's take these links that refer to data, and what if those were secured as well? And again, we live in a world with all these kinds of malicious devices and whatnot. So going back to this, I think it's important to reflect that in this room right now, there's probably something around 2 to 3 computers per person, and this number is only going to keep going up. And we'll have new and better ways of accessing the digital medium. We'll have different kinds of interfaces. AR, VR are around the corner. How many people have put on a VR headset at this point? It's a lot. Keep your hand up if you had a wow moment. Yeah, it's pretty eerie, right? And this is just going to continue increasing. How many people have worn an AR head thing? Yeah, pretty significant too. That's not quite there yet, but it's getting there. brain-machine interface is another thing that's around the corner that's even crazier. That's a bridging moment of going from this thing is displaying pictures at my face, and I'm trying to type with my finger on it, and that's a very, very, very slow mode of communication. But what happens the moment where we breach that barrier? That's going to happen sometime in the next, I don't know, 10 to 20 years. That's probably a prediction, might be totally off, but that's what it seems like right now. There are other kinds of fundamental changes coming, things like machine learning, automated and assisted systems. Think of autonomous cars. Those, I remember when those were crazy. People used to think this was never going to happen, and they're here. Again, raise your hand if you've driven around or been driven by an autonomous car. Yeah, so less people, but just wait. I'm going to keep polling people year over year, and then suddenly the room will be full. And we have robotics, finally. We don't quite have Rosie the robot yet, being able to help us, or we don't have the Lost in Space robot that can befriend you and take you and protect you from evil aliens and so on. But we suddenly now have the first few systems that can actually be somewhat robust to the environment around them, and that's that's one of those things waiting to happen that it looks kind of dumb and looks kind of silly and that's never going to happen, and suddenly the world changes a lot. Who remembers when Palm Pilots were around and people kind of laughed at them, right? But now everyone has one of these. Probably one of the most fundamental things that shifted and changed things was or at least in the last few years, one of the most important things that has happened is the development of machine learning systems that can do complex reasoning. And here, complex reasoning at the level of humans in certain domains that are extremely, extremely difficult to use heuristics for. So these are things like games like chess and Go and so on. But my favorite is StarCraft. So I think last year, DeepMind, I think using a week of training, managed to create systems that were able to beat world champions. And so this is a degree of success and capability that I don't think we fully understand and grok what this kind of thing is going to be able to do later on. All kinds of systems that can be automated, things like traffic control of all kinds, and so on can happen. How many of you are familiar with StarCraft? It's hard, right? You have to maintain an economy, you have to know how to scout, you have to go around counter strategies and all this kind of stuff. That's not easy. And so that promises very significant changes and improvements to AI and machine learning as well. So those are very significant fundamental shifts coming. Now let's think about the internet for a moment as it exists today. A lot of people shown in this slide, or imagine the people in those buildings, are like you and have a lot of devices. Usually 1 to 2 right now is kind of the average in a lot of these cities. Usually people have a smartphone and have a computer. This is very different from 20 years ago, and it's, again, only going to increase. So think for a moment how much of your life and your personal work and relationships and so on are maintained over devices. How much of that depends on the continued operation of the programs that you use day to day and the continued operation of the networks. And what kind of properties can malicious actors bring to those systems and completely change or subvert your expectations of your daily life? We are already dependent upon the internet and computing infrastructure in a way that makes it extremely both kind of a dangerous attack target, but also an extremely valuable and required thing for our daily lives. So imagine if you woke up tomorrow and you couldn't, and the internet was gone, completely. You couldn't access any of the data that was on it, or you couldn't count on it in the same ways that you do today to find things and so on. Sure, we would figure things out, life would go on, and we would kind of figure out some other way of doing things, but just think of the differential of going kind of pre-internet to post-internet. This is pretty old. I would like to get an updated plot here, but this is going to catch up very significantly over the next few years. We'll see another 1 billion people joining the internet, and that's also going to come with very significant changes. It's very interesting to note how the internet differs across the world and how different communities and cities use it. Of course, there's a lot of security problems, and there are also threats that potentially the internet might split. So that's something that's coming ahead and kind of in the near term. We don't know whether this is actually going to happen, but should absolutely not happen, and we should fight against it. But this is stuff that different world leaders are considering. I remember there was a moment when there was the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, and the hope that at some point the internet could become something like a nation, that the internet was something different from the rest of the world. That idea has somewhat fizzled lately. I don't see as many people repeating it, but at one point this was a big thing in the internet communities, and I think it's something that ought to be brought back. We should be thinking of the interconnectedness of humanity as something fundamentally different than nation states. And if we figure out some other ways of coordinating and organizing as humans, then we might be able to have a much brighter and better future than the ones that current government systems have perhaps given or not given us. I also want to highlight that there's a lot of communities that interact with the internet in very different ways than you. So, for example, one of my favorite ones is in Cuba. There's a thing called El Paquete Semanal, and that's a cache of content that moves in USB drives. And weekly, somebody smuggles a whole bunch of media, like news and video and so on, from somewhere in the U.S. to Cuba. I don't know whether this is still a thing, but for a while, yeah, it is great. So this is a really important way that a lot of people get news and information from the rest of the world, and it's a way of interacting with the internet. It's just over a really, really slow link, so normal programs don't work. But it's still the internet. Things coming up soon are things. Suddenly we'll have biomedical devices. Think of IoT, but suddenly IoT in not just in your house, like screwing up everything, but IoT in your body, potentially screwing up everything, right? So this is. I believe now there are some devices that either are IoT connected now or will soon be, which is kind of crazy. But what this sort of brings in is that these devices that are currently outside suddenly may not be in a very near future. We also have hopes that the internet will reach other planets and so on. So what I want to drive to is that the future is whatever you make it. So hopefully make it a good one, and this is entirely in your hands. Every single major innovation in computing history has been due to usually starts with a single person or a small group, and it grows from there to a large community of people that have some transformative change. And so at the end of the day, it's you who is going to be deciding whether or not we have a good future or a bad future, and I hope that you help build a really good one. So that's the main message that I want to bring you, is that beyond just IPFS and beyond whatever projects you're currently working on and so on, we're part of something extremely special that is changing how humanity operates. And we have not just the ability to influence it for good, but we have, I think, a duty and a responsibility to make sure that this goes well. I'll give a brief view into some of the problems that we're thinking about, and putting it in context of the things we just discussed. We tend to think about IPFS problems as these. We tend to kind of flash these sets of problems, things like censorship, the ability to use computing systems offline, making sure that links don't break, improving the security model, dealing with inefficiency problems, and being able to use the internet in all kinds of different networks. And this is kind of like the rating that I give us right now. This is kind of where we're at. So I would have not sort of predicted this. I wouldn't have thought that censorship was the one that we're kind of doing best at. But we have a ton of work to do as a whole IPFS community to make sure that I would love to see these things totally green in some kind of short timeline. Imagine being able to use the web and all of its amazing systems entirely in a kind of disconnected environment where you can connect to peers nearby, and you don't have to go out to some other computer somewhere owned by somebody else to interact with your own personal data. Or imagine being able to have a drastically more efficient system where you don't have to keep downloading things from somewhere else, and you can interact with each other here. So these are some other things that we've been thinking about, things of how to kind of model and improve digital freedoms, or potentially how to improve analog freedoms through secure communications. So when you think about a lot of the people that today deal with important movements against kind of their governments and so on, they face all kind of very difficult targeting where you can think of like the machine learning systems that are tracking everybody's faces in things like the Hong Kong movement recently, right? So you remember the Hong Kong like huge march that just happened. There are a bunch of cameras all over the city and taking pictures of people. So people's analog freedoms can't depend on secure communications. So if we can improve these things, then the world can be better. There are all sorts of other kind of things that derive from this, but this is the headspace and set of problems that we want to work on. Recently, we synthesized a roadmap of the things we care about and the things we want to achieve in the long term, and they are these sets of they're kind of broken down and grouped in a set of goals, and we use this as a way to coordinate a larger community to focus on some things together, because if we try to go in every single possible direction at once, we won't move very far, but if we kind of focus a lot of our attention in one area, we can land that and then kind of move on. That'll work better. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. And yeah. So one of the things I want to mention as well is if you think about platforms that you use today, the PC was a really big deal because it was an extremely open platform where you could feed your software into it and it could operate. So was the web. The web was this amazing open environment where your creativity and your ability to just make something and give somebody a link was a big reason why this thing took off so quickly. Mobile and so on are kind of in between hybrid, where it's sort of open but kind of closed. All kinds of things are not possible in a mobile environment the way that it is on the web. IoT is mostly closed. Some IoT variants are pretty open, but a lot of the systems are totally closed down. And it's unclear what's going to happen with VR and machine learning and so on. I personally think that we have right now an amazing runway of time before kind of the current social media organizations pounce on the VR world. They're already trying to do it. But do you want to have like a metaverse like the web or a metaverse like Facebook? Right? Like that's like I think the distinction in the future decision point that we'll have. So like think of being able to build application systems that operate on these. So some of the stuff that I've been amazingly proud of the whole community for doing is getting the browser upgrade path really close to done. This is something that we focused on early on, and we went from having a gateway to having a web UI and then like a desktop system, and then having a whole JavaScript implementation, and then having that work in a browser extension and with all the handlers, and having service workers. And so suddenly, getting it bundled into some browsers, and so we're right at the cusp of having much better adoption. There's still a long way for all of this to work perfectly. There's still a huge gap between kind of what works today and the level of reliability that we need. But it's pretty great to see this level of progress. On the OS side, we still have a longer way to go. We have, I think, from the simple systems to now having desktop is a huge improvement, but there's still some road to go. And I think probably the most mobile is something that we kind of didn't really focus on as a community, but then there was a few groups that really cared about mobile, pushed it to where it's at today, and now you can actually download mobile apps that come with IPFS bundled in, and you can interact with other peers and so on, which is a really cool result. I'll flash some milestones that we kind of moved through as a community. So, hey, we have content addressed data, and you can link to it, and you can get it, which is a really big deal. We broke apart sections of the project that could be used in other systems without having to rely on like this huge monolith. Instead, you can pull out pieces and start reusing them for other components. That's a big result. And there's kind of whole like stack involved in here. This whole stack and so on of systems is used across the DWeb and Web3 ecosystem. Again, browser support, OS support. We have dynamic data operating on this stuff with CRDTs, which is really awesome. So this is, again, a lot of this stuff is prototype stage still, but it's great to be able to do kind of real-time connectivity the same way that you could do in something like Google Doc, but with peers around you. There's kind of the beginnings of things like VR, and that's really cool. And then, of course, I will mention dealing with the censorship problems, things like the distributed Wikipedia mirror, and perhaps most importantly here, the fact that IPFS was used in helping distribute the locations of the referendum polling booths, right? So if you don't think that governments sometimes prevent freedom of speech, you don't have to go very far to hear from people that were around and were there on those days and had a very problematic situation where their government was preventing them from distributing information, which kind of sucks. So thank you, all of you who helped make this. We chipped in a little bit, kind of not sort of intentionally, but we chipped in a little bit in building some infrastructure that helped push this towards the future. So thanks for doing that. I want to kind of reflect, though, that computing revolutions take a long time. So the history of hypertext is extremely old, as an example. So the very beginning ideas were in 1945. There were a whole bunch of sequences of systems all the way until 1991, which was the very first massively distributed hypertext system that really worked. And that had to ride on a whole bunch of other computing innovations. And I think even Tim Berners-Lee was involved in Enquire, which is not even like the web. It was kind of like an earlier system. So a whole bunch of ideas got innovated upon all the way. So this kind of stuff is hard, takes time, and the thing that makes it happen in the end is persistence and really determination to make sure that certain kinds of results are achieved. So like Tim, the battle must rage again. The last thing I'll mention is all of this is entirely about you. You as a community, the IPFS community, is the group that is making all of this amazing thing happen. The amazing groups of friendships that were formed through this, the amazing, so this was the dev meetings that happened recently, so it's a really, really, really fun thing. I can't wait to have the slides, the pictures from this thing for the future, so I think it's going to be a really, really fun time. And again, thank you to the enormous, amazing community that we have, so give yourselves a hand. It's really this was a picture that I used at the very beginning, so thanks for joining the Fellowship of IPFS, and let's have some fun.